Chemical Hazards and Controls, presented by David L. A. Rawson, International HASP Alliance, Chapter 4, 123foodhandler.com. Let me remind you what we're doing here. We're taking a class on HACCP. We're doing HACCP here. When regard to HACCP, we need someone knowledgeable. We need someone with understanding and experience with food and food processing so that they can conduct a hazard analysis. When you're conducting a hazard analysis, you're looking at biological, chemical, and physical hazards in the ingredients, the food, and the process. This chapter is going to cover some chemical hazards that are commonly found in food processing. So let's take a look. We've got stuff like growth hormones and antibiotics, pesticides and herbicides. We have additives, processing aids, lubricants, and perhaps paints. And of course, our cleaners, sanitizers, and pesticides we use in-house. And you can see here that this chart or table or slide shows the point of use where the chemicals are introduced and what type of chemicals. And we're going to need to look at the chemical, the use, to determine whether or not they're significant or likely to cause injury, illness, or worst case scenario, death. So there's a lot to this chemical chapter. So hopefully I get you headed down the right direction. You're going to need to do a lot of research so that you can understand the chemical hazards associated with your food, your processes, and then understand the likelihood that the hazard could cause injury. So, it depends on exposure when we talk to chemicals, how much, how long. So we do know there are short-term and long-term effects to chemicals. We've done tons of studies in this country. There was actually a really interesting group of men back in the early 1900s called the Poison Squad that was contracted by the USDA to basically eat poison. And they would come in every day and eat, and then the next day they would check their heart rate, check their blood pressure, check their eyeballs to see what the effect was on certain chemicals. Amazing stuff. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, there's a book called The Poison Squad. Check it out. So there are laws and regulations designed to ensure that that overuse, or there are limits, levels, tolerance levels that are communicated in guidelines, regulations. So make sure you tie in with the EPA, USDA, and determine what are the appropriate chemicals that you can use, how much of the chemical in the certain application you're using. So just to reiterate again, there are laws and regulations that require that foods are safe and free of adulterants. What's an adulterant? It's a biological, chemical, or physical agent that's reasonably likely to cause injury, illness, or death in the absence of control. So make sure you understand all the details about everything you do all the time with regard to chemicals. The FDA, the EPA, and the USDA enforce provisions and pertinent laws regarding chemicals. So make sure you tie into that. Some of these will go outside of the scope of meat and poultry, these chemical hazards, but there's some really interesting, naturally occurring chemical hazards, some toxic chemicals that occur in plants. Maybe you heard of the magic mushroom, now legal in Colorado. Certain animals, shellfish. Maybe you've heard of puffer fish that has a poison inside. And then one that's pretty much going to impact you could be Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum. Remember those spore-forming organisms that produce toxins? Yeah, those are going to be ones you're going to worry about. Those toxins, the byproduct from the microorganism. And then there's some molds that produce byproducts. Apples, grains, certain products, when they decompose, they can produce byproducts. So a little bit more on those plant toxins, or those byproducts I was just talking about, toxins of a microbial origin. So there's a big group or a group of toxins called mycotoxins, which includes aflatoxins and patchoulin. An aflatoxin, it comes from a mold, a growth in certain products like grains and nuts. And patchoulin comes from a mold, a growth for apples and pears. So toxins of microbial origin allergens come up in this chapter too. So allergens are a chemical hazard. There are these 8 common allergens I'm going to cover here in a minute have proteins in them. These proteins induce an allergic reaction. When people eat the protein, it breaks down maybe into some various amino acids. The body cannot determine what it is and therefore has a reaction. And symptoms can be mild, like rashes, um, eczema. You've probably heard of that. Something like anaphylactic shock, though, on the worst side, which is rare but can cause death. So there are about 1 to 2% of adults and about 5 to 6% of children that suffer from allergic reaction to certain foods. Allergens, chemical hazards. So it's going to be important with regard to allergens that you know all the ingredients to all your food items all the time. You should know the top 8 food allergens, which is peanuts, tree nuts, soybeans, wheat, milk, eggs, fish, and crustacean shellfish. With regard to tree nuts and fish and shellfish, we want to make sure we put the market name of the tree nut, like almond, pecan. Market name of the fish, like cod or salmon, or the market name of the crustacean, like shrimp or crawfish or lobster. So these are the top 8 allergens. There is some guidance out on potentially number 9, which is sesame, so keep your eye out on that. And, people just want to know what's in their food. That goes way back to the early days of food regulations in our country, is declaring what the ingredients are in the product. So that's going to be a major thing we need to do is have our labels approved through the USDA approval process to make sure we declare all allergens, any changes in formulas or ingredients or suppliers. We want to make sure we look for any pass-through allergens. We want to make sure that we declare all major allergens on the label. And there's another aspect of it I've introduced it to you throughout our time, and that's cross-contact. So that you may have one product that contains allergens and another product that does not contain allergens. The problem is if you get the allergens in the product that does not contain allergens, now we have a scenario where someone could potentially die. Anaphylactic shock, although rare, could happen. So we want to make sure that we prevent cross contact. Remember the transfer of allergenic proteins to another food, another surface. So just to remind you what we're doing here, we're making our way through some of the common types of chemical hazards. So there are a small percentage of people that are sensitive to certain ingredients, certain chemicals we use in food, like sulfites and yellow food coloring. So we want to make sure, again, labels are important. Ingredients, we need to disclose the ingredients in the foods we make. So we want to make sure we have a label review process to ensure that they're properly communicating all ingredients to the food products we make all the time. Well, we've learned over time that too much of anything could be hazardous. So we want to make sure that we use chemicals appropriately. They are safe when they're used appropriately. I told you we go through rigorous tests to determine the safety of chemicals. But again, and this should go without saying, that chemicals can be hazardous when used improperly. So some of the ones to make sure you consider: pesticides, fertilizers, antibiotics, preservatives, maybe even our cleaning chemicals and sanitizers. So there are regulations that control the level of use and the maximum allowable residues of certain chemicals in food. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand the details about the chemicals you're using. Take a look at the material safety data sheet or safety data sheet and make sure you learn all the details. A big one we worry about for meat and poultry would be antibiotics and hormones. So use is controlled by USDA. We need to get an assurance of correct use by a USDA veterinarian and ensure that the Food Safety and Inspection Service approves that. So there is also some other concerns with regard to milking cows. So we want to be sure that we're testing and looking for antibiotics or hormones in residues in milk, or looking for residues in milk. So it's a big part of what we do. Some of these milking cows end up at the slaughterhouses, so there's rigorous testing to make sure that none of these potential hormones or antibiotics make their way into the meat. Pesticides are commonly used in our industry, so let's take a look at those real quick. Regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. So you want to make sure it's registered, we're using it the right way, that it's properly labeled, stored, away from food, locked, only applied by a professional. So we want to make sure we create strict policy, procedures, programs with regard to pesticides. So a couple more chemicals we're generally using in the industry is lubricants, sanitizers. So just like anything, too much of anything could be bad. So we want to make sure, again, we're using the lubricants. They're food grade lubricants. We're using them the right way according to GMPs. We create policies, procedures to ensure proper use, proper storage, proper labeling of these lubricants and these sanitizers, and make sure that no excess residues make their way into food. So lubricants and sanitizers are another concern under chemical hazards. That's not even close to all of them, but we looked at a few of the potential chemical hazards. Make sure you do your research. But now we're going to move into some strategies for controlling chemical hazards for some of the ones we covered previously. So allergen control, don't forget about those allergens, appropriate labeling. Ensure the labels reflect all allergens. Make sure that we have control of the labels, the labeling process. Make sure we have control of the formula, the formulation process. Make sure we know all the ingredients to all the food items all the time, and we have some kind of specification and supplier control program helping us manage those. If we change suppliers, make sure we're looking at all the ingredient specifications, ensuring there are no pass-through allergens. Here's that term cross-contact again. So make sure you're looking for ways to that inadvertent transfer of these allergens may happen. So we're looking to prevent cross-contact. Make sure we have appropriate cleaning. Make sure we're minimizing or managing potential dust or aerosols containing allergens. And then if we're producing multiple foods, some with allergens, some without, in the same facility, be careful using the same production line, right? We might want to make sure we have some type of scheduling, and be careful on rework product too, not to create a scenario of cross contact. A little bit more on the cross contact problem. So consider separate storage, appropriate scheduling, careful and thorough cleaning to remove allergenic proteins, minimizing and controlling traffic and traffic patterns. Make sure we have appropriate design and systems to prevent the transfer of allergens. And the most important probably here is going to be training staff, employees, to know all the ingredients to all the menu items, ingredients to all the foodstuffs all the time. And they know where the allergens are at all times. Don't forget this HACCP stuff is farm to table, boat to throat, nip to lip. So we got to work with our suppliers. We got to talk to our customers. We got to work out a lot of details. So this one talks about suppliers a little bit, making sure we have specification standards to ensure that no pesticide residues are in excess of what they're supposed to be, or there's no mycotoxins present in certain ingredients we buy, or those toxic chemicals are not in our packing material. So we're going to work with our suppliers to ensure we got things right before we receive the stuff. Drive it home a little bit more. Don't forget, we're looking at chemical hazards here. Once we identify a potential chemical hazard, we're looking for ways to control it, to minimize it, to mitigate it. So a little bit more about specifications for ingredients, specifications for packaging and materials and chemicals. Make sure we have a supplier approval program, qualify suppliers, and audit their operations. This could be a prerequisite program. And then consider getting letters of guarantee, letters of conformance to confirm the specifications. Hold these people accountable. Almost there, hang in there. So a few more things we want to look at here, like inspecting vehicles prior to unloading, inspecting materials during unloading, periodic sampling and testing, looking for chemicals, looking for drug residues, looking for antibiotics, looking for toxins. Obviously, we talked about certificates of analysis, certificates of conformance, verifying the presence, and verifying the how authentic the information that's on these certificates via testing, perhaps. So ensure only approved chemicals are used. You're in charge. You got to create policy for that, procedures for that. Designate responsibility for the receipt of chemicals, the storage of chemicals, the use of chemicals. Establish a policy, a program, a procedure at the point of use. And it's going to be your responsibility as a HACCP-trained person, as a leader here, to audit and ensure that chemicals are being properly used, properly stored. So with regard to storage of chemicals, store them in tightly sealed containers. Store any hazardous or toxic chemicals physically separated. Consider locked enclosures. Store allergens to prevent cross-contact. And be mindful of your packing material. Cover and protect from adulterants all packing material. Let me drive home one more point on pesticides. The labels of pesticides used should be kept on file. Keep a log of when the pesticides are used, how much they're used, things of that nature, so a usage record. And limit poison baits only outside the plant. They're baits. We don't want to bait them inside. And of course, control storage, locked or even off premises. Wow, that was a lot of stuff. We just covered chemical hazards and controls. So this concludes Chapter 4. Be sure to complete the chapter quiz and review all attachments. There's some good stuff on the in the guidance document that I've attached. I want you to look through there and look at the potential chemical hazards for the meat and poultry industry. And there's another book on preparing HACCP plans for the meat poultry industry. There's a nice section in that book that covers chemical hazards again. So I'd recommend you read that as well.